With our initial navigation stuff all put together, we can now start to focus on some of our different screens. So I think it makes a lot of sense to first start off with our authentication flow. In other words, the sign up and sign in screens. These two screens are going to look just about identical. So they both have a header, some inputs, button, and a link at the bottom. For just about all the different elements that we're going to create inside this application, we could create them all from scratch. In other words, we can create some buttons and text inputs, labels, all that kind of stuff from scratch. But instead, to save a little bit of time, we're going to be using a little helper library called React Native Elements. This is a library that has a ton of pre-built common components inside of it that already have some default styling applied to them. So things like buttons and headers and text inputs, all that kind of good stuff. Not a lot of functionality, just pretty much styling already put together for us. So let's first install React Native Elements and then take a look at the documentation really quickly to understand what we're really getting into. So to install React Native Elements, I'll flip over to my terminal. I'll open up a new terminal window still inside of my Tracks project directory. And then as usual, we'll do an npm install React Native Elements. Okay, while that's installing, I can go over to the documentation. A direct link to the documentation is kind of long, so we'll just do a Google search instead. Honestly, the fastest way to get there. So inside of Google, I'll do a quick search for React Native Elements and find the first link. Here we go. So on the top right-hand side, we can find the Components section. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of all the different components we get for free with React Native Elements. Now, a lot of these different components are going to have very familiar names. For example, React Native Elements has a component called button. As you're probably well aware, React Native itself has a button as well. So why would we use this button? Remember that the React Native button was only put into the library because essentially everyone said when they first started with React Native, how do I make a button? And that's the only reason that the button component exists inside of the React Native standard library. So that button element has very little customization options. So instead, if we use the button component coming from React Native Elements, we can easily customize it to get these dramatically different looking buttons very easily. If you want to see how you can customize any of these different components, just click on the section, take a look at usage, or more importantly, take a look at the props section down here, which will explain how we can pass different props to customize how the button behaves. All right, so for this first screen that you and I are working on, for sign up and sign in, we've got a piece of text, we've got two inputs, and our button. So we've already seen that React Native Elements has a button. Let's take a look at how we show some kind of like header as we're showing up here. So back inside of the documentation, there is a header, but that's for more of a classic looking header. We don't need that kind of header. We just need like a big presentation piece of text. So if we also find inside of components the text section, we can show a piece of text with React Native Elements. Now, of course, you're probably saying once again, Stephen, we already get a text element from React Native as well. So once again, if we use the one from React Native Elements, we just get a little bit of pre-built styling put into it. So in this case, if we use the text element coming from React Native Elements, we can add in a prop of h1, 2, 3, or 4, and that's going to automatically edit or change the size of the text that's displayed. So we can use React Native Elements version of text just to get some very easily configurable text element where we don't have to define that entire separate style sheet and a style section inside there just for some piece of text. And then finally, we also need to show a input. So if we go into the component section again, we can find input right there. Now this is a very stylized example of what their input looks like. This is not what React Native Elements input element looks like by default. This has a bunch of additional styling applied to it. The input element is really just a text input, same one that we're used to using from React Native, but as we've seen with all these other components, it just has a little bit of default styling applied to it. In particular, when we use this input coming from React Native Elements, we can also pass in some props if we go down to the props section like label, and that will be some amount of text to be used for labeling that text input. So this keeps us from having to create a separate text element to show next to some text input that we put together. So again, a lot of these things are going to be very familiar, very similar to what is already coming from React Native. They just have some default styling or some interesting props tied to them. They're just going to save us a little bit of time. And that's the only reason that we are using React Native Elements. We're just trying to save a little bit of time here and not obsess over styling. Okay, so if I flip back over to my terminal, looks like the installation is complete. So let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we'll get started first on our, how about the sign up screen. So we're going to use React Native Elements to show text, input, input button, and so on. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.